Oh, hey, welcome guys to the Tuesday night live stream. Welcome to the Honest Youth Pastor YouTube channel and everywhere else, the channel that helps believers use biblical discernment in all aspects of life. Welcome. We've had a lot of new subscribers this week, especially over on YouTube. So if you guys are wondering, we don't just do little video essays, documentaries. We also do this every Tuesday night, have a new guest on, or just have a discussion between me, Josh, and Matt. Josh and Matt are AWOL tonight, but we do have Troy on with us tonight. He's going to talk to us a little bit about what he does as far as podcasts and church history. It's one of those things that we didn't talk about this before we went live, but I love talking about church history and engaging with it and like just the importance of learning from it, which is a ton of what you guys do through your podcast. But before we get into that, introduce yourself, kind of tell the audience a little bit who you are, what you're doing currently, and kind of how this whole podcast came to be.
Yeah, hey, it's good to be here. I appreciate you having me on. And yeah, my name is Troy. My family and I, we are currently serving and living in Indonesia. So it's morning time where I'm at right now, bright and early at almost 6 in the morning. And it is a blessing to be here. My wife and I, we and my family, my child, my daughter, my son, we travel around. We've been in a couple of different countries at this point, Cambodia, China, and now here in Indonesia. Planning to stay in Indonesia. Love it here. But we get to serve the Lord by teaching different aspects of ethics and things that we have learned in ministry to students who really need to hear it. The students that we work with are, some of them are from the community. Some of them are from Christian families in the area. And then some of them are from ministry workers who don't get to be with their own families because their families are off serving. So this is an opportunity for us to kind of pour into them and kind of build into them. So it's a really great place to be. I love getting to do that. And even though it requires us to work on learning Indonesian and a bunch of other different things, it's a real blessing that God allows us to speak into the lives of high schoolers, especially the lives of high schoolers who, as parents, are serving God in different ways and in some very different and even very difficult places to be serving God. And so, yeah, that's what we do. And when we're not doing that, we run podcasts online that talk about church history. I run the show Revived Thoughts, and my wife runs the show Martyrs and Missionaries.
Awesome. Good deal. So we want to dive a little bit into that tonight, guys. And if you want to go check it out, I'll link it in the show notes after, but this is their site here. It has all of the ones we talked about it before we went live. A couple of these aren't active anymore, but there's still stuff on there for you guys. But there's two here specifically really wanted to talk about in regards to church history. Now, before we get into them, I do want to say if you don't follow, or we'll link it in the description below as well, but you're on Twitter, which is how we came into contact. And if you want some good church history memeing, you can go over to Twitter. That's what caught my attention, was the high quality church history memes.
Thank you.
Yes, there was top tier. In fact, I've already told you, but I'll tell everyone, I'm gonna steal some of those. We'll give you some credit, obviously, and push them back to you. But there's days where I'm like, man, I wish I could have thought of that, and so now I'm gonna rip you off. That's the cost of being on the show, apparently. So, so
go ahead.
So talk about what got you sort of into this, right? So I just enjoy church history in general because of what, I mean, we can learn from it, obviously. And I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit about, I mean, it's kind of why you guys started the podcast, it looks like, as far as in, the why you started part. But just learning from the past is so interesting as far as everything we've been through before. There's somebody else in the world as a believer that's already been through that and already processed through it, already wrote about it, probably already preached about it. So what got you initially into that? Like, what was the moment where you're like, man, this is incredibly interesting?
So I felt like I feel like I fell into church history almost by accident. I've always enjoyed history. When I was younger, I would say I was really into politics. I read a bunch of books that had to do with politics, and so I always enjoyed like American history and world history and wars and stuff like that. But church history was something that didn't really stand out to me. In fact, it kind of seemed a little bit boring to me. I saw it as just a bunch of old theologians arguing when I was younger. I saw it as a lot of kind of confusing Catholic stuff when I was younger, and it didn't really click with me. But I eventually bought a book of sermons by accident. I wasn't even trying to buy a book of sermons. I was trying to buy a biography, and I didn't read the book carefully enough to realize I'd bought a book of sermons by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And when I started reading the sermons, even though I didn't really want to, I was like, oh, these are actually really interesting and really good. And I would read little snippets in front of each sermon that would say something like, "This was preached right before, right after the Nazis took over Berlin," or "This was preached right after Hitler gave an address taking over the country." And I would look at the sermons, I would look at when they were preached, and I was like, man, could you imagine a pastor saying things like, "We have nothing to fear. Death is not something to be afraid of." 2 days after Nazis had marched through the streets with torches, basically saying, "We'll burn down anyone who disagrees with us." I was like, that's such courage and power. I can't even imagine. I don't know that I can think of a church that would do that kind of thing today. It was really incredible and convicting to me. And once I started studying kind of the people of church history, and I started learning about specific people like Martin Luther, John Calvin, Jonathan Edwards, Charles Spurgeon, and reading their stories and seeing the things that they were up against, suddenly I realized I don't know church history nearly as well as I thought I did. In fact, I didn't even know most of these people's stories. I'd read quotes by them. I'd maybe even read books by them. I'd learned about them in Bible college, but I didn't know who they really were, what they were up against in their day, what stories they were working through, and what things they were living through. I mean, these people have lived through plagues. These people, and not like little plagues, but like Black Death style plagues where everyone dies. They've lived through wars. They've lived through famines. They've lived through persecution, like crazy amounts of persecution. They've lived through tons of different conflict in their day. And when I look at the lives that they have lived, when I look at the tough things that the people that came before us have gone through, and I look at my own life and I go, oh my goodness, like I have a long ways to grow before I'm at their level. I think oftentimes we look at the Bible and, we say, okay, but those people are saints, those are apostles. That's the book of Acts. Those things are just above us, and that we're not expected to be able to follow in that line. We're going to imitate, Paul as he imitates Christ, but I'm never going to be Paul. And then even when I look at church history, I look at these guys and I go, man, I'm not even going to be Hudson Taylor, Charles Spurgeon. I'm not going to even reach to their level. And they don't have that excuse where I can disqualify them because they're biblical. And it just really convicted me of how I lived my life and realizing I have a long ways to grow before I even am able to fill the shoes of the people who came just 100 years before me.
Yeah. Well, and that's the interesting part. Like, no matter where you go throughout in church history, there's always like those people that you're looking at, and you just have those discussions in your head, or sometimes, with other people. Like, can you imagine being in that scenario and having to process in real time? Like, how do we address this? What are the words I need to preach about this? How far is the line for that? And just really, I mean, the fact that we have, and I think it's in your about section, but just, I think you reference, what was it? Hebrews, the great cloud
of witnesses is this.
And you just go like, wow, just the amount of people that have come before that have had these discussions, that have dealt with these issues. And we're over here going, no, we're the smartest people ever. Like, cause we just don't know that history. So that's amazing that you got into it just by accident. you bought the wrong book.
Was. It really truly was. It was an accident, but it was definitely God's providence, where I thought I wanted, one book, and God was kind of like, what you really need is this book. And if I can use a quote too, another one, Jonathan Edwards has at the beginning of his journal, The Diary of David Brainerd, it has this quote that says, "True religion can be taught through doctrine and precept, and also through example and through anecdote." Basically, like, this is what an example of that looks like. And then that was what he used to launch The Diary of David Brainerd, where he tells the story of this man, David Brainerd, who was a missionary to Native Americans, who was having a very hard time. He was only there for a few years. He saw some people come to Christ, but not like gigantic numbers or anything necessarily. He struggled with sickness, and then he came into Jonathan Edwards' home, and he died not too long after he got there. And yet Edwards was like, this is an example of a faithful Christian, and it will encourage you in your faith. That book ended up being his #1 bestseller. Like, a good reason we know of Jonathan Edwards today is not just because of Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, but in the 1700s, the book that everyone would have had that was Jonathan Edwards on their shelf would have been The Diary of David Brainerd, not his sermons and not his theological tomes, but his bestseller was that journal, was that introduction to this man, this example of how to live a faithful life. And then what that book did for people like William Carey, for people like John Wesley, for many of the people who would explode the missionary movement of the 1800s, they all point back to that book as their model and as their spark that got them interested.
That's so cool. Just looking at it from the 3,000-foot view, going like, this thing led to this, like this faithful man that did something that probably he thought wasn't very successful is what later down the line God uses to inspire other people, which is just, I mean, that just is an amazing story. So like you started getting interested in these things, obviously, and you're like, wow, okay, like you've already said, I just did not know as much as I thought I knew about this. And so where does it come between that point there and you going like, I need to find a way to like to share this maybe, or what got in your head to where you got to the point where you're like, hey, podcast, that's definitely what I want to do. Like, what was the thought before hearing A and B there?
Well, a long time ago, my friend Joel and I, who's the co-host on my show, we had run a small, tiny podcast for like less than a year right after we came out of Bible college. It was embarrassing. We thought we could talk theology. We didn't know what we were talking about, and we were terrible. And it was kind of the earlier days of podcasting, way back in those halcyon days of 2014. And when I was living in China a couple of years later, I was telling my friend, I was like, I feel like in China, there's a firewall of information up, and what goes through that firewall is controlled by the country of China, right? Like what you can know, what information you can get access to is kind of like it's hidden from you. So there's a bunch of stuff that the people that I knew around me, very nice people, great people, that they just didn't know about. They were just completely cut off from basic news sources and from information that would have really helped their life. And I was like, this is crazy. I was like, but I feel like in my own life, and I feel like a lot of Christians have a self-made firewall where we only let information in, and we have like it's like we've kind of created this boundary line where modern is good and everything old is out. And so all the ideas that came from basically before the 1900s are no longer really with us anymore. We don't know their stories, we don't know the people and how they lived, and we don't know a lot of the theological concepts that came before us. And so in a lot of ways, we're living with a self-inflicted firewall where there's all this great information out here. It may not be safe, it could be dangerous. It could be a little bit scary to go out there and touch it. And maybe some people wouldn't, even want us to. And yet there's great information and resources and tools if we'll just go through that firewall to go get it. And that was kind of the idea I was talking with, where I was like, we need to create something where this church history can reach others. And we created it in 2017. We started talking about it. It took us about a year and a half to get people to help us out. We had to make about 9 episodes to get just kind of a first season going, and telling people like, hey, can you record this old sermon? It's going to be on a podcast about old sermons. It was really challenging actually to get people to record those sermons because people just could not conceive what did that mean and why am I doing this? And we had to figure out, do we edit those old sermons or not before we put them on our podcast and things like that? Like, what is this going to sound like? But when it finally came out in 2019, it immediately was clicking with people, where we were getting right off the bat hundreds and thousands of downloads. And we told God, if we can get 9 episodes together, if you wanted to keep going, you're going to need to bring us voices that can speak those sermons for us every week, because every single week it's a different person speaking those sermons. And we've been doing it now for 4 years, and it's been rocking.
Nice. Yeah. Well, and right now you have, we were talking beforehand, your site says 600,000, but now you said it was up to 700,000 downloads, which is amazing. And I think what clicks there again is, we didn't talk about this before, so I'm not sure how old you are, but I'm 39. And so one of the things that I think for at least my generation, and I'm sure on either side of me a little bit, is that, like you said, those things have really been lost to us. We don't really talk about them a lot. Maybe you hear about Jonathan Edwards, Hands of an Angry God sermon, maybe once or twice, but everything else is kind of lost off. Maybe you've heard of Bonhoeffer, but you've definitely never read him. And so there's all these different things that you have touch points, but you don't really explore them. But when you start hearing their stories and you start talking about church history from a variety of different times, right, all the way back to the second, third century, or all the way up to as recently as you're talking about, those things really click with us as believers, going like, oh wow, like I'm not out here in some wilderness land all by myself. This has happened before. I mean, I just recently taught through early church history, going all the way up into the canonization of scripture at my church, and it's amazing how many people didn't know. I mean, these have been people that have been in church their whole life and hadn't heard a lot of this. And so that whole self-inflicted firewall that you're talking about, 100%, I think we do that a lot. So talk us through a little bit, because I think, these things sound really interesting and people probably want to engage with them, but let's talk about your podcast, the two that you guys you have going right now. Like, so if somebody's going like, okay, that sounds interesting. Is this going to be worth a listen to though? So talk us through a couple of the things and kind of how you break stuff down for people, to give them an idea.
Yeah, so one of our shows, Revive Thoughts, has been going since 2019. It takes sermons from the past and we recreate them again. We basically just take them, we make them modernized, so we get rid of the thou, shalls, and the thighs, all that stuff that makes it a little bit difficult, King Jamesy, and we make it listenable again. And different people from around the world will speak. We've had pastors, we've had professional radio artists, we've had great theologians and professors, but we've also had just regular people who, between working their 9 to 5s, will send in these recordings and help us out. And every time it's different, so that when you're listening to a sermon, it feels like you're in there. People say it's like listening in the pew. Like, I feel like I'm now in that church with that person, because it's not the same voice every week. And then before that, we will give like a little backstory, a little background. Who is this person? What's some important stories that relate to the sermon, so that you just kind of get a full dose of whoever it is that we're doing that week. And we found it's been very effective way to get a lot of really old people, a lot of old sermons, a lot of old theology to people really effectively. And one thing we didn't think about when we started Revive Thoughts, this was not on our purview at all, but we have a lot of English as second language learners listening as well. We've had people basically write in saying, I have no way to listen to sermons by old Puritans or sermons from the 300s or these different things, because they're really old and it's very difficult for someone who isn't maybe mastered the English language perfectly to read those things on their own. But they're like, but to listen to them and to go through your show has been a way for me to get access to a bunch of information that we didn't have. So I would say at least 18 to 20% of our thousands of listeners are people from places like the Philippines or Ghana, apparently, where they are really just cluing into our show because it's access to content they wouldn't have otherwise had. And then our other show that does really well is run by my wife. It's more popular, in fact, per episode than our show, Revive Thoughts, is. And that is Martyrs and Missionaries. And she just tells these amazing stories of, you guessed it, martyrs and or missionaries. Kind of going through the history of certain places too. Like, she has the rise and fall of Christianity in Japan, the rise of, the Christianity in Greenland. She just put out an episode on how did Christianity go into New Zealand. But then she has a lot of other really personal biography episodes. Her 3-part series on Gladys Aylward, her 3-part series on John G. Paton are just some of the best content you can possibly find, I think, on church history and what humans went through to share the gospel in difficult to reach places. If you are looking for encouragement, or if you're looking for conviction, if you're looking to be challenged, or if you're looking for hope, go and listen to Martyrs and Missionaries, and you're going to find definitely all of those things and more in those shows. They are powerful testimonies of what God can do with one person. And on the other side, they are huge challenges to how we're living today, because when you see what these people went through, you're going to go, man, I have a long ways to go before I'm living life on that level.
Yeah. Well, and I think that it's helpful for us to do that. Like you said, it's one of those things whenever you have, I'll just keep using your terminology, that firewall up, and you don't know about these stories and you've not really heard about them before. It's one of those things where you can sort of, I remember, this is way back in high school, but the whole Jesus Freak book that came out, and it had some stories of martyrs in that. And that was really the first time that I had ever been introduced, in high school, to anything like that. And it was just really like, wow, okay, like there are people that are suffering and dying, and they're going into places deliberately knowing that they could, get killed. And again, those are incredibly inspiring stories. And like you said, just overall encouraging and convicting, because a lot of the times, especially if you live in a very safe spot, you don't even think about that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. And it's super helpful in general for that. So, I'd be interested just to pick your brain on that real quick, because the stories of people that deliberately kind of go into places like that, people that are, Christian workers, maybe even like your wife and yourself. What are some, like, maybe I'll just top one, maybe, because I know I'm putting you on the spot here, but what's one of those stories that really is inspiring to you that you're just like,
I can give you so many.
Okay, give me two. Give me two.
Okay, John G. Payton's an easy one right off the top of my head. This guy, he was actually successful in ministry already. He didn't need to go overseas. He had a bunch of places he was plugged in, but he felt the Lord was just calling him, go over to the New Hebrides Islands, kind of out in the middle of the Pacific, where there are cannibals. The last guy who had gone there about 20 years before, his name was John Williams, not the composer. And he had been killed by the cannibals, and he had been, it had not gone well for him. And that guy had been a successful missionary up until, that point where he landed on these islands. And Payton was just feeling convicted, was feeling challenged, was like, I need to go. He tells everyone, hey, I'm going to go over. And everyone pretty much in his life tells him, no, it's a bad idea. He said this old man, every time he saw him, he said, they'll eat you. They'll eat you. The cannibals will eat you. And finally, he just kind of turns to this old man. He goes, I respect you. You've been in my life a long time. He's like, but you're a couple years from being eaten by worms. I'm going to be eaten by other people. We're not that different, you and I. Like, we're heading to the same place either way. And his parents were the only people who said, you know what? We'd always prayed that God would send one of our children out to the mission field. And we never wanted to influence any of you and tell you, that we were praying for that. But we were always hoping you're an answer to prayer in this way, which is its own incredible side story.
Yeah.
The number of parents in the 1800s who were praying that their children would be sent to the mission field. And back then, which was basically saying, I pray that I send this child away, I never see them again, and that they very likely die a painful death of disease somewhere, is incredible. Hudson Taylor's parents are praying the same thing over him. And yet, here we go. John Payton goes, he gets married, he heads over to the New Hebrides Islands. He gets there, and immediately, every single day, he is accosted, he is tricked, he's betrayed. They try to put him in a spot where like a curse will fall on him. They leave him in a horrible situation. Eventually, sadly, his wife gets pregnant, gives birth, but both the wife and his daughter die shortly thereafter. And he's left all alone on this island for 2 more years, trying to survive in the jungle, trying to survive while people are literally almost like chasing him around the island with spears, constantly trying to kill him, constantly giving him poisonous food, et cetera, et cetera. And when he gets done there, he eventually, at the end of 3 years, the people he'd been working with on the island, all of the people he showed up, his whole team, both of people from nearby islands and from Europe, are all dead. He heads back over when it's just too hostile for him to get anywhere. He gets back to where he was in Britain, and they're just like, if you had died, you'd be a martyr right now. We might have been able to use your name to rally more people, but you lived. So that's kind of disappointing, isn't it? And he was like, man, like I can't stop getting kicked down here. Yet eventually he gets another team, goes back to the same island chain, goes to another island where they're a little bit friendlier. And while he's there, they put him up in a spot where he's supposed to be cursed. This area is supposed to be a place where their gods killed anybody that lived there. And yet he survives no problem. And they don't understand what's going on. They're like, hey, this is our cursing spot. And eventually, out of nowhere, John just starts digging a hole. And he just starts digging and digging and digging. And for 10 days straight, he just starts digging without really like any explanation. And in fact, the natives there that had become kind of his friends go, man, we think John's gone crazy. He doesn't stop digging. But eventually he hit fresh water that was under the island. And nobody in the entire New Hebrides island chain had ever seen fresh water come from the ground. In fact, when the tribe started digging in their own areas, they couldn't find any. The only spot on that entire island where fresh water was in that spot where John had started digging. He said, I don't know why. I just felt like God was saying, dig a hole in this spot right now. When the fresh water gurgled up, they said, this is amazing. We don't have to just collect rainwater. We have water. They said, tell us about the God that brings water up from the ground. And that entire tribe became saved. That was like his stepping stone to the entire island chain. And by the time Payton dies, the entire New Hebrides island chain has given up cannibalism and is entirely Christian. And he kind of spends his final golden years just kind of traveling from island to island, basically a hero, because everyone is saved now. They've all given it up. And he said that nobody will worship God, nobody will sing praises to God like a cannibal who's given it up for God. He said, there's, I love all my Christian brothers and sisters, but when you're worshiping next to former cannibals, you're worshiping to people who just know God on a level unlike any other. Absolutely incredible story. Could not have started in a tougher place. Could not have ended off in just a more amazing way. So that's just one that I love. Another one, Gladys Aylward, who is this young woman who felt called to go into ministry. She was very frail. She was sickly and kind of young, and she didn't look good. And in fact, no mission organization felt confident enough to send her. They said, if we send you to the field, you're just gonna die, and so we're not going to. And she said, yeah, but I feel, God is definitely telling me to go. And they said, yeah, we don't think he is, so maybe you're more of a stay-at-home kind of help the mission front from home deal. But she felt like God was saying go to China, so she said, well, I'm gonna go anyway. And so she takes all the money she has, she buys a ticket on the Siberian Express and just starts riding a train out of Europe and just slowly crosses around Russia and to China. But at the time, it was right at the beginning of the Russian Revolution. She didn't know, and nobody really knew what the Russian Revolution was doing in Russia at the time. So she's just riding this train, stopping at stop in the middle of Siberia, seeing pretty much horrors outside the window of what's happening in Russia in the middle of this Russian Revolution as the communists are taking over. And she's just kind of driving along there going, oh my goodness, like, what are they going to do? And eventually the train just stops in the middle of Siberia and goes like, this is as far as the train goes. We don't go any further. And she's like, no, I'm not supposed to get off till I reach, this city in China. And they're like, yeah, but anyway, we're stopping here in the middle of Russia. If you want to keep walking, you can. And so she gets out of the train, and on a nice train track in the middle of Siberia, in the middle of the night, she starts walking, and she walks by herself down the train track as she's heading towards China. And this is after guards have stopped her multiple times, everything under the sun. And through the middle of the night, she's walking, and she says, if I knew then what I know about the woods of that area now, if I knew then that those howling wolves off in the distance that I thought were far away were probably actually just a few feet from me based on what I know about travel now, I would have never made it. She said, but I couldn't see anything but the railroad I was on, and I couldn't see anything but the stars that were keeping the light right in front of me. And so she said, even though all night long I heard wolves howling, I heard noises, I could hear things around me, I couldn't see any of it. So I just followed the train track till I got where I needed to go, following what I thought was God. When she gets to China, she's there during the middle of everything that's going on during the Great Depression. She runs an orphanage. She helps prisoners. She reaches Buddhist people. She has crazy stories where, for example, she felt like God was just saying, hey, go over this way for a while. So she just starts walking and walking. She gets mad at God, like, why am I going this way? And she meets a Buddhist monk out there, and she goes, hey, I'm supposed to go this way. Do you know anything? And they said, come with me, come with me. And so she goes over to this Buddhist or Taoist monk sanctuary, and they said, years ago, we heard this guy talk about the God of love. She finds out later it was a China inland missionary. And she said, we heard this guy talk about the God of love, but we've all been waiting to hear from somebody about the God of love. Do you know who the God of love is? And she was like, I do, actually. Let me tell you. And she had every single monk come to her room that night and spend like 30 minutes being like, tell me more about the God of love. Shared the gospel with the entire group. She leaves and goes, sorry, God, about the bad attitude. Realize now this is where you were trying to send me the whole time. And so she has these wild stories like this. She runs this orphanage. Well, in the middle of World War II, as the Japanese are invading, she has to pick up all these orphans and get them over a mountain range away to safety. She has to walk them through forests, walk them through rivers, walk them through valleys. Like, they're being chased by Japanese soldiers if they catch them. She even gets shot at one point. I mean, it's dangerous. And yet they're moving through China with this giant group of about 100 kids just walking behind her. They don't have like regular food. A lot of the kids are sick. She's carrying them. She's sick. And eventually they get to a river, and there's nowhere else to go. The Japanese army is behind them. They get to the river, and this boat has a couple Chinese soldiers that are just getting to the other side. And she says, can you help us out? And they go, sorry, you're on your own. We can't help you out. And they just leave her there. And she goes, God, I have no plan. Like, this is the end. If the Japanese army will catch us, these kids will certainly get killed. I'll probably get killed too. Like, there's no future for us here. And the kids go, well, hey, you are always telling us these Bible stories. Why don't we just do like you're always saying, Moses can split the river. Why don't we pray that God starts splitting the river? And she's like, well, I don't know if he will. And they're like, come on, didn't you say God can do anything? And she's like, well, now I'm convicted. Let's pray and we'll see what happens. So they start praying. And then they start singing, and they're singing proud, loud songs to praise to God. And the river doesn't split, but the boat comes back over with the Chinese soldiers, and they go, "What are you doing? Like, you're leading the Japanese soldiers right to us." And she goes, "I have all these kids. What do you want me to do? You know, if you took us to the other side, we'd probably be a lot quieter." And they say, "Get on the boat." And they start bringing them over to the other side and dropping all the kids off, and the kids keep going. Eventually, she does reach a city where the orphans can be taken care of, and they end up in safety. She'll end up spending, I think, until the 60s, 1960s, kind of off and on. She doesn't get to stay in China for all of it. Eventually, when the communists take over, they kick her out. But she will, I believe, run an orphanage in Taiwan till the end of her days. Just an incredible, incredible woman whose story started with, you know, you're too frail and sick to make it. And it's just incredible what she ends up doing despite that fact.
Yeah, well, and I mean, both those stories, and I'm sure, I mean, 1,000 more that you could tell us, are of people that just know that God wants them to do something and they're going to go do it. And not only that, but in both of those stories, just the perseverance to say, like, I don't know why this thing is happening. This doesn't even look like what I thought it was going to look like, but it turns out to be something that touches. I mean, in the instance of the cannibals, I mean, an entire culture is changed because of one man obeying in the circumstances that everybody else would have quit in, which is just absolutely not only inspiring, but like you said before, just convicting as all get out. So I got a question for you as well. So let's say, obviously, the podcast is great. What books would you suggest? I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of maybe compilations or maybe some, you know, I mean, you've already mentioned one of the diaries that Jonathan Edward published, but something that somebody can say like, hey, I'm not really into podcasts, or hey, this is great, but I want to really dig into it because this sounds interesting
Mhm.
and I've never heard of it before and I'd like to kind of get into it. What would be some nice entry level stuff for people to be like, hey, you know, these would be the, you know, top 3 for sure if you're interested in more recent history, church history, martyrs and missionaries that are going to inspire you
Yeah.
and really help you. Like, who would you suggest in that regard?
So we will always say, because we get this question almost every time. You know, you mentioned that I'm on Twitter and I'm posting memes a lot. Almost every time I post a meme, someone goes, "Hey, what are some books you recommended?" In fact, last night I just did the opposite. I was like, "Hey, tell me your favorite books from church history," and people went crazy recommending a bunch of different books. And some of the ones they recommended, I think, are super good. If you want those kind of overview stories, the story of Christianity is one. If you're more of a theological guy, Story of Christian Theology might be another good one. I have it kind of up here. There's looking for one by Nick Needham. He has like 4 or 5 volumes that are
Yeah,
really,
that's a
really
good
good
one.
as well. 2000 Years of Christ Power. That's the name of
Yeah.
them. You should check those out. I recommend all of those. However, I tend to not recommend the overviews. And the reason I say that is kind of, if you're new to church history, think of it like science. If you're new to science, is the first thing you want to do a bunch of lectures on science, you know, where you're going to get like a physics lecture and you're just going to do that for an entire, you know, semester without any experiments? Or is the first thing you want to do is start getting your hands dirty and, you know what, let's do a science experiment and kind of explain the science behind that as you go? And the same way, I think that a lot of us really do better when we open up with stories and biographies and you learn about these people. And then over time, you flesh out that overview as you go. And there might be some of you who absolutely are about that lecture and you want that overview first. And that's totally fine if you're in that boat. I think those other books are good. But if you want some really good biographies that kind of give you that experiment, that kind of give you that, ooh, I'm sinking my teeth into it, learning about these people right off the bat, I really recommend the autobiography of Hudson Taylor, his journal, where they basically his children kind of came in and took his journal and published it. It's really incredible. It's a mixture of his missionary journeys, telling like some really hard stories about the things he did to get into China. He arrived in China during the Taiping Rebellion, which is, if it weren't for World War I and World War II, it would be the bloodiest event in human history. 5 million people died, 30 million people at least lost their homes. It happened at the same time as our American Civil War, but nobody has ever heard of the Taiping Rebellion. It's incredible what he did, and it started because a guy basically said, "Hey, he read a Baptist tract and said, 'Hey, I'm Jesus's brother.'" And this other guy with him was like, "Yeah, I'm actually Paul." And this other guy said, "I'm the Holy Spirit." And the 3 of them started a cult that would basically almost destroy the entire country of China single handedly. And when Hudson Taylor arrived, that war was going on. He almost got his head blown off by a cannonball. He almost got killed by bullets. He was standing in one spot. He went away and he came back later. And at the hospital, all the people he'd been standing by were there. And they were all dying of injuries from that, like just minutes after he left, battle erupted there. I mean, it was crazy what was happening in the city of Shanghai at the time. And he had to use all of his medical skills to kind of constantly keep bringing people back to life or saving them. And it was a real challenge to his faith on the one hand, because obviously he's seen the worst things that can happen of war and devastation. But at the same time, he's a guy who's trying to tell people about Jesus Christ. And I'm sure they were all going, yeah, we know about Jesus Christ. His brother's a real pain and it's causing us a lot of trouble here in China. And I don't know what we want to do with this guy. And so I just always think that's got to be one of the most incredible things. So the autobiography of Hudson Taylor, really interesting book. Another one, Diary of David Brainerd. I really do recommend it especially if you like good kind of a mixture of theology and perseverance. It's a little tough at times to read because some days it's like, oh man, it's really depressing. Like it's the same depression over and over again because David Brainerd really struggled with depression. So he has a lot of dark days, but that's a really interesting one. Another one I recommend is The Journal of George Mueller. Another one that's really good if you're looking for a challenge in how you live your life. The Journal of George Mueller will challenge you because this guy ran an orphanage that eventually would be 5 different orphanages that took care of 10,000 kids, but he did it all without asking for money, just bringing everything to God in prayer. And when you read his story and you read how he did it, even if you come away and go, I don't know if I'm going to do that with my life, you're going to be challenged and going, man, am I even 1/50th as faithful as this former thief, which is what Mueller was. He was originally, before he was all that, he was a thief who turned his life over to Christ, who only went into ministry because his dad said, you're going to end up in jail, but you know who always gets paid? Ministers. You should go become one. His entire life completely flips upside down. And then if I can throw in a fourth one, if you're looking for maybe a little bit of a different kind of book, it's another book on depression, but it's called Spurgeon's Sorrows. And it goes through the sermons of Spurgeon that deal with depression. And it's a really good book because Spurgeon was the most popular pastor of the 1800s, the biggest church and the biggest empire of the entire world, the British Empire. And yet he struggled a lot with a mental battle of anxiety and depression. I think it's a really good book for people who are going, well, what about me? I'm not going to be the guy on the islands. I'm not going to be the guy running the orphanages. Well, Spurgeon wasn't those things either. He lived and worked in the city just like you and me. He happened to be the pastor of the biggest church, but look at the mental battles he went through and then tell me that you're not going through maybe similar battles or you're not going through some of those similar things. I think it's a big encouragement to see if God uses someone like Spurgeon and he goes through these type of things. I think it will encourage and convict us everywhere where we are.
Shoo, man, those are great. I'm going to have to try to get all those and put them below for sure. In regards, and I can see like one of the things before we kind of move on to the next question, before we start wrapping up, like I can see why people are very much, like I told you beforehand, I've only been able to listen through like less than a handful of these podcasts, but I can see why this has hit a nerve with people in regards to, I mean, first of all, you're incredibly passionate about it. These things are incredibly interesting. And whenever you combine that passion with that interesting part of it, it's just one of those things that you're like, man, like I've never heard this before. This is incredibly convicting just for the knowledge part of it. Like I want to know about these people. So kind of as a segue with that into this last part, what are the things that maybe people have given you feedback on, maybe people have emailed you guys about, maybe some even reviews people have sent that have said like, hey, learning about this person has helped me do this, that, or the other thing. Like just the effects you've seen of people, coming in contact with this, as you said, this great cloud of witnesses that have come before. And that has really transformed, God has really used that to transform their lives. Do you have a couple stories about that?
Yeah, so we just got this email came in about a month ago. We put out a sermon called Trust in the Lord by George Mueller. George Mueller, again, the gentleman we mentioned just a minute ago. Incredible life of faith he had. And he had a sermon called Trust in the Lord. Man, if you got a sermon about trusting from the guy who probably trusted God better than everyone else, no better guy to learn from, right? When we put that sermon out, and just a couple of days later, we received an email, very long. This person was like, I've been working on growing in God, and that sermon just broke me down, that I was not trusting in the Lord the way I was supposed to be. Thank you so much. That's like a common occurrence. It's not even, I don't want to say like we're used to it, because how do you get used to the Lord using you in those kind of ways? But like in expectation. I read an email like that and I go, yeah, that's really awesome. I'm not surprised. But there have been times where we've received emails from people that even when the Lord is using the ministry the way he's been, even these surprised us. The one that probably got me more than anyone was not a sermon, but it was because we do sermons, but we do sometimes episodes too where we just talk about church history and different things. And in this episode, we told a story about a man who, man, I sadly have forgotten his name, but he was called on by in World War II. At the end of World War II, he had been a chaplain for the Allies, and he had been to some of the concentration camps. He knew German, and he was a Lutheran minister. And so at the end of the war, they said, hey, according to the Geneva Convention, all this, we have these Nazis, these Hitler supporters, really big, high up people like Goebbels and some of the generals and some of these guys. And according to the Geneva Convention, we're going to put them on trial. We're going to do the Nuremberg trials. We're going to deal with them. But we believe that they should have, it's a human right to have access to a spiritual minister. And even though they didn't do it to their people, we're going to do it to our own. You're one of the only people who knows what a concentration camp looks like. You know what they did. And yet also you speak German and you're a Lutheran. Can you do the job? And this guy goes, yes. But basically that means you're going to the worst humans that have ever lived and you're going to preach the gospel to them for a year straight. He's giving up a year that he could go back home. And he'd already seen World War II. He probably would rather be at home with his family. He's giving up that year to go and be a minister to people that a lot of us would go. I mean, it would be really hard to even want to preach the gospel to them even once, let alone for an entire year of your life. Yet he continued to go, and he received a lot of pushback. There were people who, from the Jewish community, the rest of his days, they put him on a list of Nazi supporters because how could you preach the gospel to these people? They don't deserve it. He also got pushback from not even fellow, he wasn't German, but from the German Lutherans who said, hey, we're supposed to give communion to anyone who wants it, and you didn't give communion to some of these guys, so we're mad at you as well. And the reason he didn't give communion to them is that they did not confess Christ. If they did not repent, then he wasn't going to give them communion. He had worked in prison ministry before, another reason why they'd hired him. And specifically Goebbels had, I believe it was Goebbels, I could be wrong, but it was, I believe him who said basically like, I believe in Christianity, but I don't believe in Jesus because he's a Jew. And the guy was like, well, if you don't accept that Jesus is Christ, if you don't accept he's God, then you're not a Christian. The guy goes, no, I am a Christian. I just don't accept Jesus because he's a Jew. And he's like, you can't get communion in that way. And he would die. And the German Lutheran church was mad at this guy. I was like, how could you not give him communion when he was asking? He's like, if he does not accept Christ, how can I give him communion? So this guy got no love for what he did for a year, but pretty much every day for a year, he had to go in and preach the gospel to people responsible for designing the camps that killed millions, people responsible for prolonging the war that killed millions, for doing all these things. And I said, to me, it was just such a witness. It's incredible when people live lives like Hudson Taylor and George Mueller, these guys who do these incredible things. But it was also an incredible witness of the power of Christ, that somebody would go and truly preach Christ to people who I think a lot of us would go, they don't deserve it. And yet from a human perspective, they don't. But from God's perspective, all can be redeemed. And that this guy would give up a year of his life to preach Christ crucified to the worst humans I think most of us would say ever lived, and that he would do it faithfully, and that he would actually say by the end of it, about 4 of the 16 guys, as far as he could tell, had come to Christ, and he was giving them communion as brothers in Christ. Again, he's done prison ministry before. He knew about what to look for, and he said, look, I'm not saying all of them did, a lot of them didn't, but a couple of them, I'm confident we'll see them in heaven, that they are as forgiven as you and me. And that's incredible that we would say that the gospel does that. Well, after we put that episode out, sharing that, we got an email from a gentleman who said, I am in prison ministry and I haven't gone in a while because a man who harmed my daughter is in prison and I have to go and be in the same prison as that man. And I didn't know what to do because I knew I'd see him this week. And he said, but after listening to your episode about a man willing to share with the Nazis, even though I know what this guy has done, I know that he's no different than them. And so I'm going to go and share the gospel at that prison with that man present. And I was like, whoa, I did not expect that at all. I'd had that story for a while. It'd been something I kind of had been waiting for the right moment. I felt like the right moment had come. I put it out there and we got that email a couple of days later. I was like, man, that was the right moment. The Lord knew just when that episode needed to go out, but it was an unexpected and very powerful testimony, I think, from that. And that's just one. I mean, we have other ones from people who said that some of the sermons changed their life, were turnaround moments for them, just really encouraged them. But that was, of all the emails, all the messages, that was the story where I was like, man, I did not expect it to have that kind of a witness. And I don't know that I could do that myself. That's not something I feel confident that I could do what that guy was able to do. And I'm just glad that the Lord was able to use it. And something else that we haven't really mentioned, but another very powerful aspect of church history too, is the apologetic side of it as well. And that is how much it's a defense for the faith.
Mm-hmm.
One other thing that I think is really powerful about church history is that if you want to share the gospel, or if you want to defend the faith, there's a lot of really good stuff from the church and from church history that can really motivate people. Not only does it give you a great encouragement, but I also have found that with students, with young people, or people questioning their faith, church history can be a really good way to start getting in there and talking about deeper things of theology, talking about deeper things of God, and getting people to kind of open up in ways that if you attack them directly, if you went right after their theology or right after their Bible, they wouldn't. But when you use these examples of like, here's what it looks like when the church ran, Salem or whatever, here's what they did wrong, or all these different things, you'll find that people can kind of open up. And so I think a lot of times people don't realize how much church history is an apologetic tool that can really defend young people, especially as faith, once they start to learn it as well. And we've had a lot of success with people saying like, this was really good at getting a high school or a middle school or a little bit young, maybe a guy in college or something, to start really thinking through their faith, was using this tool of church history and using how just deeply powerful, how very defended it is in there, has been really effective too. And that's another thing that I don't think people realize when they start studying church history, how much more confident you will be in your faith when you realize just how many great people have defended our faith excellently over the years. We're not living on the cutting edge of apologetics. It's been around a very long time.
Yeah, well, and I think, I mean, a great point you make there. It gives touch point. I mean, you've given great examples tonight. It gives the human element to it. It's not just the ethereal thought of this is the right or wrong thing. It shows the lived out perseverance of living through those things, what it actually means to live out not only the head knowledge, but just live that out in real life. And it gives people that example. And you're 100% right. I know when we were teaching through church history, the nights that we were talking about just sort of the nuts and bolts of it, it was interesting to people, but what they really latched onto were these stories of these people that had gone before us, and really latched onto, and really, like you said, made them think through, like, wow, how would I do that? What would I do in that situation? Would I react that way? And I think that all together helps package it really, really well. So as we wrap up, obviously there's a ton of stuff here. I mean, it's all amazing. Where can people find you? And then obviously I'll link the site below, but just kind of connect with what you guys are doing.
Yeah, if you ever want to follow my wife and I more specifically on Facebook, we're following the Frasiers, and we just kind of tell about the places we lived and what we're doing and what God's been doing for us. We have a lot going on, and we're going to be back in the States this summer, so we have a very busy time there. If you just want to follow us, if you're looking more to follow Revive Thoughts, I'd love to say that we're everywhere, and technically we are, but we really spend most of our time on Twitter. So follow us at Revive Thoughts on Twitter. It'll say Troy Frasier, also known as Revive Studios, because that's the name of the studio that we're running here that kind of has all of our podcasts and stuff under one umbrella. You can also go to revivethoughts.com and see all of our shows, and we really hope you'll subscribe to Revive Thoughts and our other show, Martyrs and Missionaries. Revive Thoughts has new sermons every Thursday, and Martyrs and Missionaries has new episodes whenever my wife puts them up. They're always great, but they're about once a month whenever they show up. Those are the main places you can find us. You can always also reach us on places like email, and we have a Facebook, we have other things too. If you want to reach us there, we'll be a little bit slower probably at responding in those locations.
Cool. Well, Troy, it has been amazing having you on. I mean, you're clearly passionate about this, very knowledgeable of it. And I'm hoping that we can get some people over there listening to that podcast, hopefully even picking up some of those books that you've mentioned, to really get them in it. Because that's the thing. I think when you start learning that, you're not in some theological desert all by yourself, like, all of this has come before, and it's so helpful to know it, and to know these people's stories, to see how they lived out the faith, and to really see that, I mean, we are a part of that down the line. There's all these things they've done that we now benefit from and can know about. So Troy, thank you for getting up at the crack of dawn over there to come on. I think a lot of people will find it really helpful. Man, thanks.
Yeah, no problem. It's been a pleasure. I'm really grateful for you having me on. Thank you for giving me a good reason to wake up at 5 in the morning.
Good deal. Guys, if you like this, make sure you like it, share it, all that kind of stuff. Check out the links below, and we'll talk to you next week.